Hello, everyone. This is Mark Sabatella from the Mastering MuseScore School, and I'd like to wish everyone a happy Bird Day today. By Bird Day, didn't say birthday, Bird being the nickname of Charlie Parker, and today, August 29th, 2020, is the 100th anniversary of his birth. So, in honor of Charlie Parker's birthday, I wanted to present just a little bit of an analysis of one of his most famous pieces called Blues for Alice. So I know a lot of the people who follow me, some people are jazz musicians and some people aren't. And so I want to give some context for those of you who are not jazz musicians. Uh, I know that until I got to, say, high school or maybe even college, I was not really that aware of who Charlie Parker was, but he really is one of, I don't know, the single most important figures in jazz history. He kind of spearheaded a movement called bebop that eventually sort of just became the standard language of jazz. All jazz musicians since Charlie Parker are influenced by him directly or indirectly. So, Charlie Parker was an alto saxophonist, and this piece of his is one of his most famous pieces. And what we're going to look at is the actual composition, the actual melody, and the chord progression to it. And I just want to do some analysis of it. And those of you who are jazz musicians, or maybe not jazz musicians, but know something about the process, often we spend a lot of time focusing on the improvisations of these people. And really, normally, if I really wanted to get inside Charlie Parker, that is what I would do. I would want to take a look at one of his improvised solos and analyze that. But for today, I want to look at the piece itself, the composition, and sort of talk about that whole process. So I hope you enjoy as I kind of take you through a tour of Blues for Alice. So the first thing I have to do before I get any further is just point out that uh, to avoid any potential copyright issues, I'm going to let you find the original recording yourself. In fact, I'll just put it down in the comment. I'll put a link to it, and then you can go listen to the original recording of it and hear what it sounds like in context. For now, what we're going to hear is the computer playback here from within MuseScore. So let me just play the melody and let it speak for itself, and then I will do some speaking. So that's basically how the piece goes. And I should mention that there's probably not really any official sheet music for this published. That's very typical with jazz pieces. I mean, you could probably find some somewhere to buy, but that is just someone's transcription of the recording. The original sheet music that he wrote out for himself and whatever musicians he was playing with, maybe it's in a library somewhere, but that is not usually the source. So usually the source is people listening for themselves and then kind of sharing, maybe commenting on each other's transcriptions and trying to build what we think probably the piece looked like. So this is my rendition based on having looked at other people's and listened to the recording. And if you want to quibble about certain notes, whether this F here is really a G or some other thing, because there's ghost notes. When he's playing, it's ba da bop, that ba ba bop, that It's just it's a schwa, right? To use English terminology. Ba, if you listen to the original recording, ba, ba, ba. I'm off key. I'm sorry about that. So that little sound of this F, it's not really a very clear pitch. So yeah, there's some places where you could quibble some things like that, but this is the basic piece. So I want to start off talking about the overall form. The word blues is right there in the title, and it is a 12 measure composition, and it's 12 measures, but when you listen to the recording, you'll hear it's way more than 12 measures. That's because they keep repeating this 12 measure form, and they play the melody once, and then they take turns improvising over this sequence of chords. And then they play the melody out at the end, and then they kind of just repeat this last phrase a few times, and um, that's a typical way of organizing a jazz composition. So the composition part itself is really just these 12 bars. And 12 bars is a typical length for a blues, but this is a very complicated blues as far as uh, how blues chord progressions normally go. So I want to talk, I think, first about where that comes from. So I want to look at the most generic blues in the world here. This is a really generic blues. Let's make it a little bigger here. And you see in the key of F, we have a 1 chord for 4 bars. And then the next 4 bars is 4 B flat coming back to 1 F. And then the next 4 bars we have 5 C coming back to 1 F. This is the basic structure of a blues. The first phrase is all about the 1 chord. The second phrase is about 4 coming back to 1. The last phrase is about 5 coming back to 1. There's a million different variations, and if you play in a blues band or have experience with blues bands and how they organize their blues progressions, they might start here and have their variations. In a typical jazz setting, we might have our own little variations on this, but Charlie Parker really goes the extra mile on this piece. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a popular piece for musicians to want to improvise over, because what he does with the chord progression is so interesting. So if we look at it, I want to point out that the F chord here, the B flat chord here, and the C chord here, the one, the 4, and the 5, we're going to see evidence of those same chords, right? Here's our 1 chord. Here is our 4 chord to start the next phrase. And the last phrase doesn't start with the 5, but there's the 5 in the second bar there. I like to say anything 5 can do, 2/5 can do better. This is a general jazz truism. So we have 2/5, G minor 7 to C7 in the key of F. And so uh, that that's a very typical thing. That's not like Charlie Parker going wild with it. This is really fairly basic stuff in the jazz world. We'll have a 1 chord, we'll have our 4 chord here, and then we'll have a 2/5 instead of just a 5. So that's the basics of it. Um, I think to unpack what's happening next, I want to look just at the first 4 bars. If you look at it, there's this incredible sequence of chords that goes all over the place rather than just 4 bars of that 1 chord. In a blues band, you will very often just sit on that 1 chord for 4 bars. At most, you might do what they call a quick change, where they come to B flat and then back to F. You go to 4 a little early and come back before the real trip to the 4. Well, Charlie Parker says, no, I'm not even going to bother with that. I got this whole other thing for you. And what it is, it's a trip along the circle of fifths. So let's look backwards from this 4 chord here. Looking backwards from B flat on the circle of fifths, we have 2/5 in the key of B flat. Well, that in itself is fairly typical. If all it did was go F and then maybe this C minor to F7, that would be pretty typical. Or even F and then the quick change to B flat and back to F, and then C minor to F7. That would be typical. But it wasn't good enough for Charlie Parker on this piece. So he says, hey, I got my C minor 7 here. Let's give it a 2/5 also. So D minor 7 to G7. And that's how he gets to that C minor 7. And then he's like, well, if you can go with me that far, let's go one further here. I got the D minor 7 here. How about a 2/5 in the key of D minor? And he gives you an E minor 7 to A7. So we have an entire circle of fifths from E to A to D to G to C to F to B flat, all organized as 2/5s. We have C minor 7, F7 is 2/5 in the key of B flat. We have D minor 7, G7 is a 2/5 in the key of C. And then we have E minor 7, A7, which is 2/5 in the key of D. I am kind of hedging on whether this is a C minor chord, so this should maybe be a 2/5 in the key of C minor. And if you know much about these things, you know the 2 chord in C minor should be a half diminished chord, right? There should be an A flat in the key of C minor, but his melody note is an A, so he gives me a D minor, not a D minor 7 flat 5 or D half diminished. And similarly, this E7. I think many people play it as an E minor 7 flat 5. I probably do also. but the melody note has got a B in it. I think it makes more sense to actually play it as an E minor 7, and from henceforth, I think I will try to remember to do that. But I'm so used to playing that chord as a half diminished chord from in other contexts that it's just sort of ingrained in me. So he gives us this giant circle of fifth journey here. The next thing that happens is in the second phrase here. Instead of just being four, remember our basic blues here is just four and back to one. Well, what he's giving me here is something a little different. So, first of all, instead of coming back to one, he's going to A minor here, which is three. Well, three and one have a lot in common, right? If you think about an F chord, let me get my F here, get my pitch. F, A, C, E. That's an F chord, but if I leave out the F, a, C, E. That's A minor, right? So the three chord is just the one chord without a root. And that substitution happens all the time in jazz. I think in classical music, it's more like what you would expect is maybe to hear the one chord in first inversion. In jazz, we just play the three chord and call it good, but it's largely the same thing. It's got that A in the bass instead of the F in the bass. So he's giving us that. And that's, again, pretty typical in a jazz setting that we might do that. Um, but the other thing that he does is instead of just sticking with that B flat chord for 2 bars and then coming back to one or three here, he does this other thing that jazz musicians sometimes do, but he's like giving you the kitchen sink. He's giving us everything here. It's not like jazz musicians have never used these secondary 2/5s like this, but giving you a whole chain of them to get to four, that's pretty unique. Um, and then the thing that happens here is we're going from four to one. Well, instead of going directly there, he's going four and then minor four. So there's our minor four. So bum is the third of this chord, and then dum is the third of that chord. So it's a B flat with a third, and then B flat with a minor third. Um, B flat with a third, B flat with a minor third, and then F would have been an F, but instead he goes to A, and that gives you this nice voice leading from B flat, A. So it's nice voice leading in the bass. But that minor four chord there, this is not a unique thing to jazz. None of this is unique to jazz, but it's the way jazz musicians combine it, and especially the way Charlie Parker really just gave us a huge case study in all these things is really very just brilliant, I think. So he gives us that minor four chord, but then he's not satisfied with just that. He knows that this minor four chord, it doesn't belong in the key of F, right? The key of F major doesn't have a minor four chord, but the key of F minor does. The key of F minor has a minor four chord. That also in the key of F minor might lead to E flat 7. That's the 7 chord, or the flat 7 chord, I would call it, in the key of F minor. So these two chords kind of know each other from the key of F minor. They're both diatonic in F minor. So these are what are called borrowed chords. And in a classical context, that 4 to minor 4 to 1, that is a fancy amen. Blah 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 F, and then ahs are minor four men, right? So minor four all over classical music, but being able to put that flat 7 in there, now we're talking jazz. So four minor four flat 7 1, except instead of one, he's giving us three. So that's that bit of the chord progression. If it was just that, it would still be like a brilliant piece, and we would be talking about it, 60 years, 80 years later, however many years. I don't know when he wrote it, but it's his 100th birthday today. So I'm going to say he wrote it probably uh, 70 years ago, probably. Um, I should look that up, but you'd rather hear this, then you can go look it up yourself. So we've got this, and in a lot of other contexts, after we hit that three chord, we might just go to six and then let that go to two and call that good. That's a 2/5 in the key of G minor, and we might call that good. So that could have been enough for him, but he was like, nope, I got one more. I got one more for you. And what it is okay, now that he's given us this D7, uh, there's this interesting thing. in jazz, and I won't have time to go into all the details of this, but it comes up all the time where we call it tritone substitution. A classical musician will know the exact same sound, well, if you've taken enough music theory, as an augmented sixth chord. And what it is I'm gonna gloss over some details here, but it's all about this D flat seven chord resolving to C7, D flat seven to C7. Uh, in this is a dominant seventh chord built on the flat six scale degree, and then it resolves eventually. This chord. Remember, this it was supposed to be just a C7 here. Charlie Parker just kind of expanded it. Well, let's unexpand it in our mind so that we're really hearing the D flat seven going directly to C7. That idea of a dominant seventh chord sound on D flat 7 on flat 6, then resolving to 5, is called an augmented sixth chord. And it's called that because the interval from D flat to B natural would actually be an augmented sixth. Really, I should call this, in fact, oh, this is a B flat, right? If it had actually been a B natural, that would be an augmented sixth. Um, I might call it a C flat because I'm calling this D flat seven, D flat seven, and D flat seven has a C flat. So there's a difference in spelling between a jazz musician calling this D flat seven, which is spelled with a C flat, versus calling it an augmented sixth chord, which is spelled with a B natural. But either way, it's the same basic sound, the sound of a dominant seventh chord built on scale degree flat 6, resolving to 5. And I said that jazz musicians call this a tritone substitution. The short version of why this is true is if you think about how you would normally get to C, you'd give it its own dominant. You'd give it a G7. Well, D flat 7 and G7 are a tritone away from each other, G to D flat. And so we're substituting D flat 7 for G7. And it's an interesting substitution because they have the same third and seventh, but backwards, right? G7, B is the third, F is the seventh. D flat 7, B or C flat is the seventh, and F is the third. So the third of one is the seventh of the other, and vice versa. So this idea that we have D flat 7 as a way of getting to C7 comes from classical music. It comes from this augmented sixth chord, but the spelling of it and the conceptualization of it as a tritone substitution is sort of a jazzism. But then the next interesting thing that Charlie Parker does is say, again, anything 5 can do, 2/5 can do better. So I think of this as a 5 chord in some key. This becomes 2/5, 2 to 5. And now, when we combine it with what we just had before, we have A to D, and then A flat to D flat, and then G to C. It's this series of chromatically descending to fives. It's I'm not going to claim this was the first time this ever happened because I know of a couple other songs that do this, but again, having the presence of mind to say, "Hey, I can do this here." This is part of Charlie Parker's genius. These chromatically descending two fives in this particular spot of the blues. That's a lot of stuff going on in just 12 bars harmonically. It's deep. We got to see secondary dominance, we got to see borrowed chords, we got to see tritone substitutions, and you get to see all of this kind of packed into a short period of time. So let me just play the tune again, and now you can hear it with this knowledge of how it came together. There we go. The song doesn't actually end on the 5 chord, not to worry. Although actually it ends with it ends with its own little thing going on. But this C7 is just designed as what's called a turnaround because, as I said, this 12 bar progression gets repeated over and over again. That C7 is there to get us back to the F. So most of what's really fascinating about this piece in particular is that chord progression, because Charlie Parker wrote many blues tunes, many tunes based on a blues chord progression. And this is the one where he kind of took the chord progression itself the furthest. His melodic language on this is uh, more typical for Charlie Parker. And so there's plenty I can say about it, and I'll say a few things, but it was really the harmonic language that I wanted to get into, in part just because that's where my brain goes as a pianist and composer. I'm often thinking about harmony, but I don't want to ignore the melody, because the melody is, of course, the part that we respond to in the piece and recognize about the piece. Although actually, this chord progression is so distinctive that jazz musicians will often be playing some totally different blues chord progression. They'll be playing some other blues tune, and in the middle of their improvised solo, some random saxophonist might just start improvising over this chord progression. He doesn't say anything about it, and but just through his choice of notes, it's very often possible to tell, oh, he's playing that Blues for Alice chord progression. And then the pianist and bass player will go jump into there with him. So it's such a distinctive thing that people use it in that way. And that's sort of it really is very much about the chord progression for Blues for Alice. Anyhow, looking at the melody, I'm just going to kind of talk through some of his devices here. We have just basically arpeggiating the F chord here. And now, again, we're just basically arpeggiating the E minor 7 chord. Now, here he's coming down this A7 chord, arpeggiating down, going through that flat 9. And this is such an important part of the jazz vocabulary, that if you have a dominant chord resolving to a minor chord, you probably want to put a flat 9 on here. This B flat comes from the key of D minor. And by putting that B flat on the A7 chord, it helps really accentuate that you're going to D minor. And this is a tried and true classical technique, really, also, but it's one that jazz musicians totally take to heart and use very often. So he's giving us that. He's also giving us this device here, B flat to G to A. A is the chord tone that he's kind of targeting here, and then B flat and G are what's called an enclosure, preceding it by the note a step above and a step below. And then again, arpeggiating from there. And now he's got a little ba-da-dum. This little figure here, classical terminology, that's called an escape tone. G is our chord tone. We sort of go step up to the A and then leap down to another chord tone, and then step our way into the next chord tone. And he really targets that third. The way I like to look at this is this little use of this whole device here is like he's thinking, I want to get myself from G to E flat, but I got four notes to do it. I want to come up with an interesting shape to get me to that E flat, and take four notes. And so that's kind of what this is about. And a lot of this happens a lot in improvisation. This may have been originally improvised of a melody, and then he was like, yeah, I kind of like that, and then wrote down what he just played. Probably he hadn't recorded it. Probably he, who knows how he wrote it. But a lot of times you do kind of improvise something and then write down to the best of your recollection what you played because you kind of like it. Then he does this other really typical thing here of arpeggiating up 3 5 7 9. That is such a typical jazz arpeggio. 3 5 7 9. Also the use of the triplet interspersed with these eighth notes. Oh, I didn't mention rhythmically the anticipation here, getting to that A half a beat early and then tying it over the bar so that it's a syncopated anticipation. We're getting to the A early, and then we're getting to it on the and of four rather than one, so it's a syncopation. And now after this arpeggio up to the ninth, stepping down to D flat, which is a syncopated anticipation of the F7 chord. So we have that going on, and this, I say it's part of the F7 chord, but what is this? This is the flat 13. Flat 13s, just like flat nines, they are, if this had been going to a B flat minor chord, D flat would make total sense. But this is a thing that we do in jazz all the time. Even when we're going to a major chord, we'll borrow some of that minor sound. So even though this F7 is going to a B flat major or B flat dominant chord, we use over this F7 some sounds that come from B flat minor. So we use this D flat. We would possibly sometimes use G flat. Um, which is the flat 9 on this chord. But in this case, no, he uses this flat 13. Um, this type of device, well, I'll just keep going through. He comes down to the fifth and an upper neighbor coming back down. And then here is a ninth. It's a appoggiatura, to use a classical terminology for it. He's leaping up to this note that's not a chord tone, and then stepping down to one that is, and then this is arpeggiating that chord, and then again with the appoggiatura. G is maybe a chord tone on the B flat. Is this a G? Is it a B? Is it an F? You listen to the recording. Yeah, I think it's probably a G, but whatever. Um, E flat is not a chord tone, but D flat is. So again, he's landing on a non-chord tone on the beat that he leapt up to and then stepping down to, just like he did here. Non-chord tone, stepping down to chord tone. Non-chord tone, step down to chord tone. So he's doing this thing, leaping up to the non-chord tone and then stepping down to the chord tone. He does it twice in a row here. And then in we have this other thing that's kind of an enclosure type of figure. It's like he's targeting this C and he's giving us a step above and a couple different steps below to get there. Now this C is not a chord tone over E flat 7. So I can't put a specific classical analysis to that. But I can say that it does feel like the D flat kind of wanted to resolve to this C. It is kind of maybe a one way of looking at it. So in any case, it is a sixth, it is a 13th on this, and so it's a use of a non-chord tone right there on the beat. A very jazz thing to do, using a 13th for its color. And then leaping down to something where you can step then into the A. Again, it's anticipated. Again, it's syncopated, and then boom, and arpeggiate down here, but also it encloses the D. And then again here, he's got this non-chord tone. D flat is a non-chord tone that again is anticipated on the end of 4 and uh, syncopated. It's tied over the bar line, and then it steps down to the chord tone C flat. And then he lands on this 13th again. So that this use of this 13th in this significant way feels like a deliberate device here as a compositional device. And then coming into our chord tones here, that's all just arpeggiated. This quarter note triplet is another kind of jazzy device there. And then these are all kind of ghost notes. Um, it's again landing on a 13th, and then there's a root, and then we get this blue note. It's the first thing he's done here that's specifically blues language, using that minor third on a major chord, on a dominant chord. Well, he is speaking a blues language here, even though he's thrown in all this really sophisticated harmony. At the heart of it, it's a blues, and that E flat says, "Yep, I'm a Kansas City guy at heart, and I'm gonna give you the blue notes that you expect when you hear a blues because it's part of his language." So and then and just lands right on that note. And doesn't resolve it or anything, just give you that flatted third or sharp 9 if you want to call it that, but that blue note over that C7 chord. In the key of F, that's flat 7. So, and then it's becomes just more arpeggiation. That E is kind of a ghost tone also. And then this idea that he kind of lands on this note that's kind of a ninth of that chord, another jazzism. We're gonna like give you a color tone, and then he does it again, landing again on a color tone, the 13th. So you can see him using the ninth in that significant way at the beginning of this measure, and then here, and then using the 13th in a significant way here, and here, and here, right? So Charlie Parker is using these ninths and 13ths. And so you might think, wow, that's a lot of theory going on, a lot of stuff that's going on. Boy, I'm glad he wrote it all out because he could never do that improvising, right? Well, no, the fact is, one of the most amazing things about the human potential to me is that we can do this improvising. Charlie Parker did this improvising, did the exact same kinds of things improvising, and it's not, I mean, it was amazing when he did it, but what we realized by studying him is we can do the same. And now thousands, hundreds of thousands. I don't know how many jazz musicians there are that could probably do a credible, a passable version of Blues for Alice, improvising and using these same devices. There's thousands, maybe even millions of jazz musicians who can do this, and it's amazing that improvising we can pull this stuff off. But then again, it's amazing that we can talk in grammatically correct sentences, and we're just making this stuff up, and we're making our subjects agree with our verbs. It's not more amazing than spoken language, except that not as many people focus on doing it. Whew. So, again, happy birthday. I just wanted to unpack this stuff in here, and yeah, go listen to Charlie Parker. That's what's important. But listen to it on a channel that's set up through his record companies or publishers that have the rights to his music, and go check out the music that way. But by looking at the piece here, I can provide some extra analysis, some extra um, context for enjoying the music. So let me just play it through it one more time now that I've talked through the chords and talked through the melody. Let's just hear it all together. Here you go. So thank you so much for hanging with me as we take a look at Blues for Alice. And one more time, happy birthday, everyone.